This is putting a tiny bandage on a gushing wound. And unless you call in the specialists to be able to actually manage the wound, this country is going to bleed dry. Since August 15, 2021, the vast majority of border closures have actually been conducted by the Afghan Taliban. When we decided to send back, we also saw last year that AGB, Hafiz Bahadur, an individual who has traditionally maintained distance from the TTP and has always kept his operations separate, also seems to be coordinated.
Hello and welcome to InferTalks, a podcast where I put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. Today I'm joined by a thought leader, data specialist, and communicator, Mr. Zeeshan Salahuddin, who's currently associated with Tabadlab. Zeeshan, welcome to InferTalks.
Thank you so much for having me. And I see we're off to a great start with all these lies you've told about me.
Oh, no, not at all. I think I've been quite very humble by not, specifying the different designations that you hold at Tabadlab itself. And let's be honest, Tabadlab itself is doing some brilliant work, and so are you. Let me go ahead and ask my very first question about Tabadlab itself. And, when you actually look at some of the content you guys have produced, you seem to have done quite brilliant work in terms of work on, health policy, education, militancy, terrorism, foreign policy, so much, and so many areas to cover. But then, if I were to ask you, how do you sort of rate yourself and, compare yourself when you speak of other think tanks in Islamabad itself?
It's a very interesting question, and I'm not going to be immodest and rank ourselves in terms of where we stand, but I think the principal thing to understand about Tabadlab is that first and foremost, we're actually not a think tank. The think tank is our secondary identity. It's something that has become very prominent because of the sheer volume of knowledge and information and reports that we put out.
So what exactly is Tabadlab in that?
But we are predominantly a advisory services consulting firm.
Oh.
That's our core identity. That's where most of the business comes from. That's what we work on. The firm is also divided into specific centers, and each center has its own thematic focus. So, for example, ESY is Education, Skills, and Youth, and we've clubbed those three words very purposefully together because we feel that with a population of 241 million, of which half is below the age of 23, skills, youth, and education are inseparable from one another whenever you have a conversation about those. And these days, we're actually having a much more robust conversation specifically on learning outcomes. In fact, we've just put out a document on learning and the learning poverty that Pakistan experiences, one of the lowest that we have in the region. So that's one of the centers. We have several others. You mentioned some of the others. We have the Center for Gender and Public Health. We have a Center for Digital Transformation. We have one center that I lead, which is called the Center for Regional and Global Connectivity. That is all of our foreign policy, transnational security, international governance-based work. And more recently, I've also gotten into, because I'm demonstrably and measurably insane, I've also gotten into climate change and Pakistan's debt situation, because those two really sort of exacerbate and inform one another. So that's how Tabadlab works. There's a lot of centers, a lot of teams that work on various different projects, and there's a lot of cross-pollination as well in terms of how we do things, because many of these topics, particularly gender, particularly climate change, are very cross-cutting and cross-sectional, and therefore that interdisciplinary approach is central to the way in which we pursue things.
Do you think, is it primarily for that reason that being a think tank is a secondary thing for Tabadlab? Is that perhaps one of the reasons why Tabadlab is able to come out with quality conversations, in terms of having that liberty or that space to come up with more critical narratives?
There's a very specific formula that we apply to it. The first aspect of it is everything has to be grounded in data and evidence.
All right.
If you don't have the empirical, tangible evidence to back up your claims, don't talk about it.
Right.
That's the first and foremost. The second piece of it is actually communication and packaging. So you can have the best information in the world, the most robust information in the world, the most compelling information in the world that is technically and tangibly and empirically sound. But if you are unable to package it in a manner that is aesthetically pleasing, that grabs the attention of the intended audience, it serves absolutely no purpose. And third, and perhaps most importantly, how do you then use this packaged, data-driven information to engage with people? That engagement in the modern think tank world looks more like a 200-page report
Yeah.
Whereas change might come about from a single WhatsApp message sent to a senator who was about to step into a standing committee on X, Y, or Z,
Right.
and arm them with the information that they can bring up and therefore drive actual meaningful change on the ground. So it really comes down to those three aspects of it. You have to have the proper data, you have to package it properly, and you have to engage the right people in the right way for you to be able to actually drive any kind of change. And I think that formula, that sort of triangle, has really sort of set us apart in terms of being able to drive these critical, thought-provoking, and change-inducing conversations.
Right. And so how do you make sure that you don't end up becoming one of the echo chambers in town to sort of, make sure that the conversations and your organization, appears to be adding value than just, being a noise in the crowd?
That's a really great question. I think there is too much noise, and cutting through that noise is important. And if you'll allow me, one of the recent examples that I can give you is what we call the dead deck. It's labeled a raging fire.
Right.
And interestingly, when we first called it a raging fire, there were some members of our advisory board that said, you are a think tank, you work in data. This is too sensationalist, maybe revise it. And then we actually presented the data, and they said, this is not sensational enough. This is, the situation is really, really bad. You should actually make it more sensational. But that document, it's a deck. It is the complete and comprehensive look into Pakistan's entire debt crisis.
Right.
Why is it that we owe so much money? Who do we owe this money to? What is the breakdown? Why does our interest payment keep going up? What do future projections look like? What are some of the ways out of this dilemma? Now, of all the research that we've put out, which has now been covered by Bloomberg, it's been covered by the Financial Times and other various international and local media, the key thing is that none of it is primary. None of the research is primary. All of this research exists in a range of PDF documents, Excel sheets across the EAD, Ministry of Finance, State Bank, Pakistan Bureau of Statistics, IMF, World Bank websites. But no one has actually bothered to sit down, spend a considerable amount of time and effort and energy, put all of this information together in a neatly packaged resource that you can reference for driving any kind of conversation related to debt in Pakistan.
Right.
That's where we specialize, right? So information that even already exists, that does not have to be gathered from scratch, being able to understand it, parse it, put it in a format that is easy to understand and digest, and then present it to the right people, I think that's where we actually...
So what you've done is basically compile the overall data, bring it in such a condensed form that it's usable, both for, a policymaker, an economist, or, say, any reader who's quite interested in understanding Pakistan's
That's exactly
debt crisis. Right. So what are some of the interesting, or may I say, concerning indicators that you've come across about Pakistan's debt trap? Or not debt trap, but debt crisis, sorry.
Interesting terminology right there. It means the indoctrination is working really, really well.
It's just a slip of the tongue.
In the simplest terms, Pakistan's debt crisis is completely unsustainable.
Right.
The manner in which we are accumulating debt, the quantum of interest payments that we have to do, and our perennial inability to both control our fiscal account as well as our current account. So our inability to increase remittances or increase exports or attract more FDI into the country, or rationalizing internally our revenues versus our expenses, is effectively causing us to borrow constantly.
Right.
Add on top of that the fact that we have certain other crises that are now forming. I'm sure we will talk about some of those. A big one among them, of course, the security crisis that is now looming. And another one that is completely unpredictable, predictably unpredictable, and that is the threat of climate change. We saw the floods in 2022 and the kind of devastation they wreaked across the length and breadth of this country. $33 billion in both damages and rebuilding costs alone. That's effectively 11 to 12% of our GDP. So when you put all of those things together, the line that I started in the beginning rings true and should be an absolute alarm bell for anyone who's working on finance, on the economy, on the debt crisis in Pakistan. That our current debt position and the manner in which we are managing Pakistan's debt is completely unsustainable, and we need transformative changes across the length and breadth of our policy landscape for us to be able to manage.
So when you look at the last 3 to 4 governments, both have a very, and I must say a pretty, an unimpressive record when it comes to both borrowing and spending, borrowed money both from external and internal lenders. My question then is, like, what kind of habits have you really seen on part of the governments that actually, exacerbate Pakistan's debt crisis?
So one of the habits is a constant reliance on debt as a driver of growth.
Okay.
Now, this is normal and it happens around the world. Debt very commonly fuels growth. But the problem in Pakistan's case is that growth is not productive. It is not industry focused. It is not export oriented. I'm giving the example. Right. So when we get additional money, we don't use that money to enhance industrialization.
Right.
We don't use that money to enhance exports in a particular sector that could net Pakistan more dollars as we put more of that product out there into the world. Instead, we consume it. So we are a consumption-focused, import-addicted economy.
Right.
The vast majority of that money is instead used to pay off salaries, to pay off debt, to pay off interest on debt, and most importantly, consumption. Pakistan's consumption rate is one of the highest in the world. Last year, when we put out the data in the deck goes up till the end of 2023, was at 84.2%. The number this year is over 100. So in the GDP formula, our consumption is at 100.5%. This is unprecedented. And unless that is curbed and brought back to a manageable level, my colleague, the actual economist who helped write the report, Mr. Ahmad Habib Khan, he argues that if we can stabilize it at around 75%, there might be some hope. But the manner in which we're proceeding right now, be it our tax to GDP ratio, so how much tax we collect, be it our export to GDP ratio, so how much of our GDP is accounted for as far as our incoming dollars are concerned in terms of our exports, what kind of growth percentage do we have, if whether or not we are able to move from the 2 to 3 bracket all the way up to 6%. If there's any major reforms that are made, if the anti-export bias is removed, and if consumption is managed. If these 6 factors can be really tackled by the new incoming finance minister, and I have high hopes, then there is a slither, a smidge of a hope of some kind of change happening that would allow Pakistan to steer its way out of the current crisis that it finds. As it currently stands, you know this, Usama, better than I do, we will inevitably go towards our 23rd IMF program. Yeah. That negotiation is going to happen. It's likely there'll be a mini budget. It's likely that the sectors that are already getting squeezed and are inside of the direct or indirect tax net are going to get squeezed. And these are not solutions, right? This is putting a tiny bandage on a gushing wound. And unless you call in the specialists to be able to actually manage the wound, this country is going to bleed dry.
Do you think the government is serious in cutting down its expenditures by scaling down its size? And, despite the fact that we're in an age of digitization, we don't see a lot of emphasis and effort by the government to move in that direction. A, towards the devolution of power, and B, towards, augmenting digitization into the overall process of the governance itself. How helpful do you think perhaps a move in that direction can be helpful in terms of scaling down the expenditure of the government itself?
Sure. The first thing is this government is a little too raw and a little too young for us to be able to make that determination. And I think...
But the faces are not new. I mean...
The what?
The folks and the faces are definitely
of course, the faces are not new, but there have been some shuffles that have been made. I think there's broader recognition of the fact that there's a much wider problem. This document that I was speaking about, I've presented in multiple spaces, including the EAD and other policymakers, and they all seem to be in agreement that, yes, we are at a crossroads where something drastic needs to happen.
Yeah.
So much of the focus, you might recall, in the last few weeks has been who's going to be the finance minister, who's going to be the finance minister, who's going to be the finance minister. And there was a fear that Mr. Ishaq Dar would be brought back as the finance minister because the IMF would not be particularly happy with that. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't actually matter who the finance minister is. This is something that our firm's CEO, Mr. Musharraf Zaidi, also wrote in the news yesterday morning. What matters is what their priorities are as far as solving the economic crises, and I don't say crises that plague this country. So I think it's a little premature to determine that. That being said, yes, in addition to all of the 6 factors specifically that I mentioned and all of the things that we have to do, the transformative change that we have to bring about, I think digital governance especially, and particularly under the 18th Amendment, devolving powers to the district all the way down to even the union council level is the path forward. And that is the only way that we're only actually going to be able to solve the problems of a population of 241.5 million. even for a smaller province like Sindh or KP, centralizing power and trying to solve issues related to the common man in the most remote parts of that province or region is just it's untenable.
Now, let me actually, take a step back and come to this problem of, discussing this issue of terrorism itself and take a look at it from a more regional perspective. And when I say the region, it has to do with our western borders and our western neighbor, Afghanistan. A recent report by the United Nations actually termed having a symbiotic relation between Al-Qaeda, Afghan Taliban, and the TTP. How do you then see this threat of TTP has sort of evolved in the last 2 years, especially when you actually see the upsurge and an uptick in attacks from the group itself inside Pakistan?
First of all, I want to thank you, because this is my area that I've focused on for the last 15, 20 years, right? I've been speaking about the debt situation and the climate situation in the country because I specialize in security-related issues, and both of those are very much security concerns. Economic security and energy security, water security, climate security are all very, very important topics. But this is my original stomping grounds, like the area that I'm most comfortable in. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be able to speak about it. As far as the situation is concerned, the situation is dire. You might have seen very recently that there seems to be some kind of patching up that has now also happened between JUA, that's Jamaat al-Ahrar, as well as the TTP, that's Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, therefore indicating closer cooperation and coordination between these disparate groups. We also saw last year that AGB, Hafiz Bahadur, an individual who has traditionally maintained distance from the TTP and has always kept his operations separate, also seems to be coordinating increasingly with the TTP, and the TTP really has kind of coalesced and matured into this much more centralized, much more structured, focused, much more governance-driven organization than just your run-of-the-mill terror group that wants to just create havoc and cause problems. The UN report regarding the nexus that exists and the coordination that exists between these three groups, of course, this is something we've been saying for years. There's obviously a symbiotic relationship. Ayman al-Zawahiri, when he was killed in that strike, I believe it was in July of 2022, if I'm not mistaken, he wasn't killed in some remote part of Afghanistan. He was killed smack dab in the middle of Kabul, in one of the most posh neighborhoods, an area that is traditionally and predominantly protected by the Haqqanis. So the coordination is absolutely there. If you saw the interview recently of Noor Wali Masood conducted by Mr. Ihsan al-Atipu, our good friend over at the Khorasan Diaries, he is adamant about the fact that, they don't have fighters in Afghanistan. There's very little, even though they're ideologically aligned with the Afghan Taliban. And of course, he's going to say all that because their objective is to distance themselves as much as possible, because their close alliance with the Afghan Taliban creates a lot of issues for the Afghan Taliban, both with Pakistan and the international community writ large. So all things considered, what we've seen since the unilateral breakdown of the peace agreement in November of 2022 is a dramatic escalation in attacks across Pakistan. And their stated objective, of course, always has been to target security forces, because their war and their fight and their ideological underpinning for everything that they do against the state has to do with the state security apparatus more than anything else. And to a lesser extent, the so-called ruling elite, as they label them, even though the ruling elite is not necessarily their favored or stated target. This is a situation that...
But they, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Zeeshan, but they also targeted, I think, probably barbers in one of the KPTD areas. I'm not able to recall the specific district, but I'm sure you do remember this.
Of course. I mean, look, outlying incidents will continue to happen. You might recall that last January, and I think it was January 28th, there was a bombing conducted in Peshawar Mosque that killed 81 police officers, 3 were civilians. Yeah. And the TTP then came out and stated that they didn't do, even though they originally accepted responsibility, they said this is not them, they didn't do this, they didn't target places of worship. Because every once in a while, in an organization that large, that is comprised of, by some accounts, between 22 to 31 disparate entities or factions of the former TTP, there is a possibility that, the orders don't get translated down into the ranks, or somebody's a rogue operative, or someone decides to do something that falls outside the lines and parameters and the ambit of influence that the TTP's central command enjoys. So things like this will continue to happen, but predominantly their focus is on security agencies.
Right.
And we've seen this happen. I mean, the numbers that have come out of the KP in particular in northern Balochistan, there's a systematic, targeted campaign of brutalizing and murdering law enforcement, paramilitary, and military targets in this country. And they've been largely very, very good at it. We've seen hundreds of law enforcement agents killed, and that's the predominant mechanism they use to both create the sense of, if your protectors are not protected, then how are you protected?
So then how do you see the role of Afghan Taliban? I mean, Pakistan has reached out to them on various occasions in terms of taking care of this threat, or at least the violence that's actually coming from TTP itself. How do you see the response so far from the Afghan Taliban in terms of dealing with Pakistan's concerns?
I think the response has been very lackadaisical. But there's multiple caveats to that, right? Pakistan no longer seems to have any kind of a leverage as far as Afghan Taliban are concerned. I conducted the ARC dialogue, which is the Afghan Regional Collective Dialogue, all the way back in November or early December of last year. And one of the things that we discussed, and there were 26 experts from 6 different countries speaking about counterterrorism in Afghanistan specifically. And one of the things we spoke about was the fact that so much of the conversation centers around what is the leverage? How do we force them? How do we make them see our viewpoint? How do we make them? How do we make them? How do we make them? And the fact of the matter is that's the wrong approach. Anytime you approach the Afghan Taliban with the mindset of how do we twist their arm, coerce them, force them to do something, they will retaliate. They will absolutely hit back with, this is not something that we're going to do, or this is not something that we're comfortable with, we're in complete control, and so on and so forth. So Pakistan's leverage doesn't exist. We did have leverage, or some form of leverage. I would argue that it's not necessarily leverage, it's coercion. But when the Ghani government was there, or the Karzai government was there, you could block all trade points, from Chaman to Angurada to Torkham to Kharlachi to wherever else there was, and therefore stop all shipments coming into the country, which would, of course, affect NATO and ISAF forces, which would then affect the government. Another way was to, this constant threat of we're going to send the refugees back. A big portion of that we saw happening last year in October. Another thing was stopping all visas or stopping individuals that are coming to the border with valid education and or medical tourism visas, and not allowing them into the country. None of those factors are points of leverage anymore.
No, but the geography hasn't changed.
I understand the geography hasn't changed, but if you were to look at, for example, border closures, since August 15, 2021, the vast majority of border closures have actually been conducted by the Afghan Taliban. When we decided to send back, by one account, it was close to 420,000 individuals back to Afghanistan, the Afghan Taliban welcomed them back with open arms and said that we're very happy to have these individuals back, and by all means send them over the border. So those old mechanisms that we use to sort of coerce or force the power centers in Afghanistan to do our bidding no longer work, which is why we've now employed the services of people like Fazlur Rahman, to Maulana Fazlur Rahman, to go to Afghanistan, to have these negotiations, to talk to them, to try and see how we can, through dialogue, solve some of these issues. That's the first caveat. The second caveat, and the point that the Afghan Taliban have used to bring Pakistan to the table as far as negotiations with the TTP are concerned, has to do with the fact that Pakistan for 20 years has been talking about how the problem in Afghanistan cannot be solved through a foreign entity coming in and conducting military operations. It has to be solved by Afghanistan, by Afghans, and most importantly, it has to be solved in a manner that is befitting of the grace and the dignity of the Afghan people. So that's the second caveat. The third caveat is that the Afghan Taliban are very aware of the fact that they cannot rail against the TTP. So there's not really any kind of major kinetic operation they can conduct against them. The TTP, by one UN report, has close to 5,000 fighters inside of Afghanistan. Now, this is not something that Noor Wali Masood would say. He would say the vast majority of them are in Pakistan and they're able to strike targets and whatnot. But we know from multiple sources, intelligence operations, as well as the UN report, that a vast majority of them do reside inside of Afghanistan. Having those people turn against the Afghan Taliban is a nightmare for the IEA. Also because they're fighting their own internal battle against the ISKP, which has, really kind of reared its head and taken a foothold inside Afghan territory.
But they've been relatively able to have, relative success against ISKP. But then, why are they so reluctant to act against
The ISKP
TTP?
and the Afghan Taliban are ideologically misaligned, right?
Yeah.
They always have been. They've always been at odds. They've always been at war. But the TTP and the IEA are not. They are very much on the same page. You might recall that when August 15th happened and the Afghan Taliban, in coordination with the US forces, entered Kabul, one of the first things that Nur Wali Masood from the TTP on this side of the border did was to swear allegiance to the supreme leader, to the Emir. That's the first thing that happened. And one of the things that happened within the first few weeks is that the Afghan Taliban let hundreds of TTP fighters that were languishing in Afghan jails go as a sign of the Taliban are back in power, and therefore our other Taliban brethren on the other side of the border, we are not going to do this to them, and they are free to go. So the level of coordination, the level of ideological alignment, the level of cooperation between those two groups, I mean, you can't really compare the TTP with the ISKP in that sense. And that closeness, that fealty, I would say, is not really going away anytime soon, which means the IEA, in many ways, is actually quite powerless to do much of anything, at least kinetically, about the TTP. We've seen some statements come out. The Supreme Leader has also issued a decree saying that TTP must not target any targets inside of Pakistan. But those are just words, and they're not going to have the intended effect, as we've seen multiple times.
But then what do you think can actually have the intended effect in terms of, bringing an end to violence from TTP itself?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
How is it that you bring to bear on an entity that feels incredibly and remarkably empowered, that feels that despite a 21-year war that was designed to displace them, or 20-year war that was designed to displace them, they've come back more powerful than ever? How do you convince an entity that despite not finding formal sovereign recognition from any country in the world is still running the government? Their people have not starved. Afghanistan has not gone to the dogs. The governance systems have improved. The security situation has improved. So when you put all of those factors together, it seems like Afghanistan under the Afghan Taliban might have actually always been a better idea. Now, we know for a fact that this is not the case, particularly when it comes to females, women's rights, and female education in the country. But the fact of the matter is, the leadership at the top is convinced that they are the most powerful they've ever been, that they are untouchable, and that anybody that comes to Afghanistan will be buried in the mountains. Right? So now multiple other scenarios have been thought about, war-gamed. The intelligence community has looked at it. These include everything from, let's raise more men in the mountains. That's not really going to help anything because you replace one type of entity with another type of entity that is completely uncontrollable. And Afghanistan, we've seen from multiple historical examples, that's not the way forward. Another way is, do you then make it conditional upon the Afghan Taliban that if you were to be given some kind of conditional sovereign recognition, here are some of the things that you should be able to give us in return, be they female education, be they better governance structures, be they movement and operations against the TTP. But then you weigh that against what an actual move against the TTP actually means for the IEA. And what you can put on the other side to balance the equation, it becomes very nebulous and very amorphous. A third thing that has been discussed quite a bit is there are significant regional players, particularly in predominantly China and Russia, that can be brought to bear upon and impress upon the Afghan Taliban about how there are groups in Afghanistan like the IMU, the ETIM, the TTP, the ISKP, AQ, that present threats to both regional players and international players. And by virtue of that, all of those need to be summarily dealt with. Otherwise, Afghanistan is always going to remain, this, instead of the heart of Asia, the heart attack of Asia, I guess, more than anything else.
Right.
So I don't know what the answer is. Researchers, scholars, intelligence operatives have been working on and trying to come up with solutions. But I think in the midst of all that, one thing that absolutely cannot stop and should continue unabated is conversation. So dialogue and discussion and discourse are definitely the way forward. Any kind of a stall in that process only leads to further problems down the line.
All right. Now, my next question is actually about counter-narratives. Counter-narratives, particularly, when it comes to countering extremism. We saw previous governments come up with initiatives like Paigam Pakistan, and then we saw right after the unfortunate attacks back in Peshawar in the EPS itself, we saw government come up with something like National Action Plan. But unfortunately, what we've seen is not seen a lot of credible follow-through when it comes to building up counter-narratives. What do you think is perhaps the way forward in that front? Or perhaps the alternative is just to, sort of like go forward with disrupting platforms like Twitter, etc., which, frankly, tend to not solve anything. What do you think then solution is really for, going forward in terms of dealing or countering narratives, that actually give a lot of credence or perhaps, provide basis for exercising violence, especially by youth? And I'm saying particularly that by militant organizations.
Mm-hmm. That's a very complex and very, very good question.
And I would like you to touch both, the narratives that actually exist both in physical spaces and those in the online domain as well.
Of course.
Yeah.
So let's tackle that part of it first. Narratives that exist in physical spaces and narratives that exist in digital spaces. I think those two are married to the point where they're inseparable.
All right.
I think a big part of the reason why we've seen social media bans, particularly in the lead up to the elections, as the PTI fought back and as the PTI, put together so many of these rallies and online forums and online mechanisms to ensure that their candidates got the votes. And by all accounts, they took the vast majority of the votes, despite not being a formal party by the time the elections arrived, indicates that the youth in Pakistan in particular is very deeply entrenched in social media platforms, is listening to conversation that, people like me, people of my generation, millennials, Gen X, boomers, are not a part of or not necessarily, involved in. So that's the first aspect of it, in that the marriage between the physical space and the digital space is now inalienable. And I don't want to use crass language, but let's just say I think it's quite ill-advised for policymakers to ban platforms such as X, such as Facebook, such as Insta or TikTok or whatever the case may be. And we've seen some of these things happen across the world. It's not just Pakistan. I mean, President Biden just announced that he would very happily sign the bill if there was a bill passed by Congress to ban TikTok, because TikTok is one platform that has been used, very heavily by his rival, but also because TikTok is still viewed by the U.S. administration as a Chinese product and ploy. Point being, this is not something that's specific to Pakistan. These kind of things are happening in the most advanced nation on earth, or the allegedly most advanced nation on earth. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, us as Pakistan, we have gotten exceptionally good at killing people, and we've seen this happen in the war on terror that we fought in this country. I mean, we went in and we wiped out every militant group that existed in this country, save a few. Right? We saw this massive surge starting on June 15th in 2014, before the APS attack, by the way. That's when Operation Zeeshan started. The APS attack just expanded its scope and its footprint and the quantum of effort put in. But we've seen that Pakistan is very capable of conducting heavy-duty kinetic operations and rooting out people physically. But what we're particularly bad at is killing ideas. And that's because ideas, by their very nature, are designed to germinate. On top of that, I think we have elements and interests in this country that want certain narratives to not necessarily go away completely. I had a conversation with our former National Security Advisor, Mr. Moeed Yusuf, and he gave me a very interesting term that I now use everywhere. The strategic depth, for example, that we speak about as far as Afghanistan is concerned, has really become more of a strategic compulsion and now, frankly, a strategic liability. Because we are now seen as the strategic depth. The depth is in front of you, right? It's not necessarily behind you. So we're very good at killing people, but we're not necessarily good at killing ideas. And even those ideas continue to take root, as we saw in the form of the TLP's rise to power, particularly in the last elections, not so much this time around, and the fact that their very hardliner, far-right narrative was actually completely overtaken and in many ways co-opted by PTI. The PTI took on the TLP and beat them in their own game. That was actually kind of a remarkable thing to witness in this country. the terrifying implications of it notwithstanding. So you put all of those disparate elements together and you realize and recognize that we are not particularly good at counter narratives. You know, conducting various ISPR campaigns or having like a nice little slogan or doing a song on television that runs across all channels is not producing counter narratives. A counter narrative is a concerted, state-wise, establishment-wise, country-wide effort to completely change the manner in which we have a particular conversation. So, for example, the conversation about debt can no longer be inflation is very high, things are very expensive, we don't know how to survive. The conversation now has to be this is completely unsustainable and it will be undoing of Pakistan, and here's the data that proves it.
Right. And now, speaking of debt itself, I have an interesting question.
What have I done?
This is again, something taken from your own recent conversations and this very idea that you proposed in this very report that you were talking about earlier. And this is especially about, this idea of green swaps. We know Pakistan has been getting hit by climate-induced disasters for more than last 1 decade, I must admit. And we've seen, the floods actually wreak havoc across the country. Your idea of green swaps, could you sort of like walk us through what are you really suggesting to Pakistan and to the international community in terms of, managing the debt itself and to better prepare Pakistan to deal with climate-induced disasters?
So climate change has 3 pillars, right?
Right.
The first is adaptation. That applies more to Pakistan than the other 2. Adaptation because we are a country that is not responsible for the greenhouse gases that have brought about climate change as we know it, but we are effectees of it. We're part of the so-called global south. And the vast majority of the pollution conducted in the world, the GHG emissions, actually come from the global north, which comprises the EU, Canada, the US, Australia, and more recently China and even India. So that's adaptation. The second pillar is mitigation. That applies in a small, limited capacity to Pakistan, but especially applies to countries that emit a lot of greenhouse gases and therefore contributed to this ever-expanding climate problem globally. The third pillar is loss and damage. And loss and damage, of course, is the idea that countries that have suffered the consequences of climate change, despite climate change not being of their making, there should be some kind of reparations made. So if we quickly look at all 3, L&D as an idea has been accepted. Our former climate minister, Ms. Shadi Rahman, was at the forefront of the G77, the group of global south countries that led the fight for it at COP27. L&D was formed. And the first day of COP28, the L&D was operationalized. And now, if I'm not remembering incorrectly, I believe there's $792 million in the L&D fund that can be given out to countries that need it. That's not really a solution. The floods in Pakistan alone caused $33 billion in damage.
Yeah.
Our national climate policy in the World Bank report, the CCDR, states that Pakistan needs somewhere north of $200 billion between now and the end of 2030 for both our climate transition and our adaptation efforts. Even if we were to get 100% of the 792 million, it's a tiny fraction of the money that we need. Not to mention, Usama, the fact that we will have droughts, we will have heavy rainfall, we will have floods, we will have heat waves, which will continue to cost the national exchequer and continue to, the term that you use is wreak havoc on our national infrastructure, lives, and livelihoods. I mean, we seem to just forget how massive or how biblical those plagues were, but one third of this country was underwater, and you could see that in satellite imagery.
Yeah.
And people also seem to have forgotten how many people died. There was 1,753 Pakistanis that died in these floods, and close to 12,000 that were injured. This was unprecedented, unlike anything else we've experienced before. So if we look at all of those things and keep all of them in mind, and then also gauge them against Pakistan's debt crisis, we find 2 things. The first being Pakistan's debt crisis inevitably exacerbates Pakistan's climate crisis. The reason is our interest payments and our debt repayments are so high that we don't have enough money to be able to fulfill the social contract. The social contract being the state will provide security, it'll provide education, it'll provide health, it will provide social protection. And most significantly to the question that you've asked, it will provide protection against, in the form of adaptation do climate change. But we don't have the resources to do that because so much of the money has to go towards interest payments. The other thing that we find is that the climate crisis inevitably then exacerbates the debt crisis.
Yeah.
We don't have the money to do climate change related activities, especially in adaptation. So where do we get this money from? The obvious answer is debt, which means climate change inevitably exacerbates our debt profiles. These two problems are circular in nature, and it's a downward spiral that keeps getting worse and worse as time goes on.
Yeah.
Now, green swaps are not the solution, or capital T, the solution, but they are a part of the solution. The idea behind the green swaps is very simple. It's that countries that face tremendous climate and debt stress, any kind of bilateral entity, multilateral entity, or commercial entity to whom this country owes loans to should, by virtue of the country being in climate and debt stress, be able to restructure or completely write off a portion of the debt or a portion of the interest with the guarantee and the promise that that country will put that money instead towards climate finance, whatever the financing might be. We're going to equip 50,000 poor homes in Lahore with solar energy. We are going to put embankments next to this 30-kilometer stretch of the River Indus that inevitably floods during flood season. We are going to ensure that there's a climate resilience course that is taught in public sector universities.
Right.
Whatever it is that we need to do in order to make the country more responsive, more proactive, and more adaptable towards the inevitable changes that are coming from climate change. We put money towards that instead of putting that money towards debt repayments and interest repayments.
Right.
And there's multiple mechanisms that exist. There's some very salient examples that exist across the world, particularly between the US and Latin America. And the idea here is that if we can convince certain bilaterals, so China owes one of our largest debts, some smaller portions are owed by Japan, by France, by Germany, and if we can convince some of these bilateral entities, if we can perhaps convince the two major multilateral entities that own almost 90% of Pakistan's multilateral external loan, that being the World Bank and the ADB, or if we can convince commercial banks that own some of Pakistan's loans to be able to do these green swaps, it will create this breathing space, right, for us to be able to do certain things that protect some Pakistanis. Because the material and life and livelihood cost of the climate disaster is astronomical.
It's quite interesting that you make a mention of this, but let's say, a counter argument that does come to my mind is that, all of it really boils down to Pakistan's ability to have a capacity building in place, and then to have, like a person like you has sort of cited, like on top of your head, some concrete plans to sort of tackle these issues. But when it comes to the government, it really does not. Suggest or list down these solutions to probably carry out something like, the green swaps. Then how do you think then is the way forward when you speak of not having concrete plans and then just reaching out to the international community that, we want you to pledge this and this much amount, and then again, those amounts, like what we saw a couple of years back in the last government, which reached out to the international community. They were able to secure pledges around $10 billion US, but then those pledges, again, most of them were old loans repackaged to Pakistan again. So how do you think then should the way forward be?
In English we say you've hit a nerve, but I think it's said so much more poetically and appropriately in Urdu, and that is "Dukhti rag pe ungli de di hai aapne." It's a problem, of course. We have 18 cabinet positions that have, or I think 19, that have taken oath.
All men? Barring one woman? Or?
I believe the state minister might be the female, but
Right.
the rest of them are males.
Yeah.
The gender dynamics and the unfortunate nature of our perennial inability to prioritize women in this country notwithstanding, of these 18 federal level ministries, the one person or the one ministry that did not have a minister assigned, of course, is the Ministry of Climate Change.
Right.
Because climate change continues to be deprioritized by this government. We had a climate minister before, and more recently at COP28, we had the caretaker prime minister, who went and spoke about how badly Pakistan is affected and what kind of destruction is caused by extreme climate-related events. But the fact of the matter is the world is not going to take you seriously if you yourself don't take the crisis seriously. Now, even if there was a federal minister, and this is the alarming part, Usama, that I think your audience should especially pay attention to. Even if there was a federal minister that was assigned to the Ministry of Climate Change, there wouldn't really be any provincial ministers assigned to the Ministry of Climate Change because provincial departments of climate change do not exist. There's been a move more recently to convert EPAs, the Environmental Protection Agencies, into climate departments, which is effectively just overburdening them and stretching out the resources to just tick a box and say, okay, now we have climate departments at the provincial level. But the fact of the matter is that doesn't actually happen. We don't have climate departments. So when our climate minister goes to these international forums and talks about how Pakistan is going to reduce its emissions by 50%, given certain parameters and certain international help, the fact of the matter is that minister then has no mechanism, no conversation mechanism to be able to actually have that conversation with the provinces and enforce that policy. Right. Another way to do that, for example, would be transport departments, but transport departments really treat the registration of vehicles as an exercise in revenue collection and not as emissions control. Our EV policy, for example, that we have adopted applies to below four-wheelers. So when you look at all of these things combined, it seems that despite all of the conversation that Pakistan wants to have, especially after the floods, especially what we saw in Geneva in January of last year when we went and tried to raise money, especially after the floods, what we say and do at COP28, it seems to indicate that Pakistan is suffering a great deal and therefore Pakistan should be helped out. But when you look at how seriously Pakistan actually treats the existential threat of climate change, we fall very, very, very short. And so one of the key things, for example, the work that we're pursuing right now, I've already spoken to you about the debt profile that we've put together. We're now working on a piece of work that looks at climate swaps. And a big part of our focus is, for example, the DG debt, the Ministry of Finance, the State Bank of Pakistan, the Economic Affairs Division. And the reason for that is because if we don't speak to those individuals, we don't really have a way within the Ministry of Climate Change for us to be able to make these conversations salient, centralized, and robust at the international stage.
Now, coming back to another area, and that is foreign policy. We've seen individuals actually have an impact in terms of how, foreign policy is conducted in Pakistan. And the same goes for, how policy about different governance issues can be impacted by role of certain individuals. But now let me ask you, we've had, Mr. Ishaq Dar being brought into this role as a foreign minister. How do you think is his appointment affecting Pakistan's overall foreign policy trajectory in the days to come?
The PMLN is back in charge. The PMLN has been in power in one way, shape, or form for almost 30 years. Right? It's the same faces, same people, same individuals. It's Nawaz and Shehbaz and Ishaq and Khwaja Asif. And, it's the same rotating cast of characters that might change portfolios slightly along the way. And frankly speaking, if Nawaz Sharif had been prime minister, he would do what he always does, which is to hold on to the foreign minister portfolio. But despite him not being the prime minister and therefore not holding the highest office in the land, his policy still holds because he is the leader of the PMLN, and therefore the PMLN leadership does take their cues from Nawaz Sharif. And one consistent policy point of view that Nawaz has had for the last 30 years is the normalization of the relationship with India. And therefore, he is going to put his most trusted advisor in charge of the foreign policy because Pakistan's space within the foreign front is now incredibly limited. It's shrunk, and it's a very difficult space to navigate. Now, I would argue that given where things are, both geopolitically and with India, and I'll explain what I mean by both of those things, it's a bit of a fool's errand at the moment. The saffronization that we've seen in India, particularly because of the Hindu-Vata ideology, and how that has affected both electorate as well as Modi's incredible rise. I mean, if you look at the statistics, India has gone from being the 10th largest economy in the world to the 5th, and soon to be the 3rd. I mean, there's no comparison here. The comparison that existed in the pre-Manmohan Singh era no longer exists today. India is massive by all means, and under normal circumstances, For people of South Asia, this would be a cause for celebration and jubilation, but unfortunately it's not. And that relationship is not going to normalize. Indian elections are also due for April or May of this year. It seems likely that Modi is going to secure the next term, which means that for the next 4 to 5 years, once again, the relationship is not going to thaw, and India and Pakistan are going to remain roughly where they are.
But any 3 to 4...
Sorry if I might finish. In terms of their bilateral relationship, however, India will continue to rise in a variety of other ways, including tech transfers, including an expanded focus on export-led industries, particularly digital and IT, and they will continue to be, a rising power in this region, and that's particularly important to Western interests because it serves as a direct counter to China.
Before we wrap up our conversation, any 3 to 4 areas where you think India and Pakistan can actually make some progress?
The number of areas that Pakistan and India can make progress in is, it's been documented by historians, academics, trade specialists, economists. It is the most logical choice for a trade partner. We have, all kinds of cultural ties, language ties, customs ties. There are zero circumstances under which we should not be able to work with India, but current geopolitics don't really allow us to do that. A big problem, of course, is always going to be Kashmir. I know there's a lot of conversation that is happening at the national level now about how we should separate the two streams, and Kashmir should be its own separate conversation. Pakistan and India relations should be its own separate conversations. I don't think that's actually possible. And now we are in a geopolitical stage in the world where everything that has happened in Gaza has happened. There's a blueprint that now exists on how to leverage an incident that happens in order to completely decimate and depopulate a region and shake up its ethnic as well as shake up its ethnic makeup. And the same formula could very easily now be used by India in Kashmir, as we've seen since August of 2019, the various restrictions that have come into play. And because the elections are also coming up, a major provocation there I would not really rule out. So when you put all of those things together, Mr. Ishaq Dar being in charge of the foreign policy as a veteran politician, somebody who's very accomplished, very well versed in matters of foreign policy, and Pakistan really does need help in that regard. I would say for me, it's a bit of a fool's errand to try and focus on India as much as we do, because there's an overemphasis by the PMLN sometimes, particularly on India. I think a better idea would be to focus as much of our effort and energy there is to fixing a lot of our internal problems.
Right.
And when we have these conversations, so for example, when Mr. Dar goes to France or Japan or China or Germany and speaks about the bilateral debt that we still owe these countries, perhaps one of the things that you can speak about, armed with the knowledge that, for example, we've produced, is how do we actually leverage this amount of debt that we have, get it written off, get the terms changed, get the maturities changed in order for us to be able to focus on more important internal matters, be they health, education, social protection, climate change, whatever the case may be. So how he performs, what he does, he has just taken oath. It's anybody's guess, but he is a veteran politician. He is very well trusted, has the ear of Nawaz Sharif, who has led our foreign policy portfolio for a very long time, and will inevitably try to fix things with India. How successfully he is at it is, at this point, anybody's guess.
That's still a matter of time. Zeeshan, on this note, I'm sorry we've run out of time, but on this note, really appreciate you joining us for this conversation and concluding this podcast on that note.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. Really glad to be here and hope to be back soon.
Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation with Mr. Zeeshan Salahuddin. Our team works very hard to make this work possible, and it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content. And if you'd like to stay informed about our upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.